Yangon is a bowl of warm rain and tungsten light. It's the kind of night where street cats keep to the awnings and the betel nut stands glow like little theaters. Lin Hetet moves through it with the trained precision of a city white-collar phone, on silent, backpack zipped, umbrella angled to miss the shoulder splashes, until the rain thins to a silver veil, and the hill rises in front of him, like a sleeping beast wrapped in gold. Shwedagon is not a place you arrive at. It receives you. Even through the rain the stupa gleams, a lamp set upon the city's long table. Flip-flop footsteps pad across wet marble, and somewhere a bell strikes a soft, forgiving note. Near the southern stair, a woman in a light travel coat fumbles with a map and smiles at her own mistake. Japanese, late 20s, hair damp with rain, eyes that register and hold, like a camera that dignifies the moment instead of stealing it. First time? Lin asks, English softened by Yangon, the sentence carrying an easy shrug. She laughs. I thought this is the east stair, but maybe I walked in a circle. Everyone walks in a circle at Shwedagon, he says. That's sort of the point. They climb together, shoes left at a rack that already smells of soap and monsoon. The terraces open like a slow-breathing chest. Old women whisper Polly. Young men move in careful angles around them. The rain tapers into a glittering mist that catches the floodlights and lays them down, velvet soft on the gold. I'm Aiko, she says, bowing a little. I study memory, in art, in stories. Memory's a big subject here. I'm Lin, he says. Brand strategist by day, professional overthinker by night. Overthinker is also memory researcher, she teases. He means to say something witty back, but a gust of incense arrives like an old letter, and with it unexpected, uninvited, a corridor of brick cooling under night, a sound like water where no river runs. And behind his eyes, a sun-hot room where the dust glows, and someone is teaching a boy to hold a reed pen straight. Lin blinks. The corridor shatters into gold and rain again. Aiko is watching him, not with alarm, but with the same steady curiosity she's shown every step. Are you all right? It's nothing, he says, which is the city's way of saying everything. I get flashes here. Stories cling to places. Then I picked the right guide, Aiko says. If you have time tomorrow, I'm here 2 weeks. Yangon is beautiful, but I want to see the old country under the skin. He wants to tell her he has back-to-back stakeholder calls and a deck due by Friday, that he has a dentist appointment he's been rescheduling since March. Instead, without quite deciding, he hears himself say, I'll take you north. Pye, Mandalay, Bagan, places where the bricks still remember. They sit beneath a small shrine where a thin monk has just refilled the oil cups, and the night grows lighter as the rain gives up. Aiko points to the tiny flames. In Japanese temples, we say the light is an eye open. What do you say here? We say the light makes a road, Lin answers. Sometimes to the past. The bell strikes again, and he feels a door his life has kept politely closed to begin to yield. They leave at dawn in a bus, whose aircon breathes unevenly, and whose curtains insist on swaying even when there's no wind. Yangon's concrete gives way to rice fields, then low towns with tea shops arranged like acts in a familiar play. Plastic stools, steam, men quoting the news from memory. Lin orders mohinga and pours chili like an apology to the fish. Aiko photographs the way light sits on aluminum teapots and somehow makes them look noble. On the way to Pye, the road keeps company with the Irrawaddy, a river that looks like a slow thought. Lin's phone naps. The map turns into a long green strip that doesn't need instructions. He talks to keep the ghosts from choosing their own entrance. Between the 9th and 13th centuries, he says, Bagan was the place where devotion and brick met and made a city. People love to quote the number 10,000 temples. We don't count numbers well, but we do count desires. Every donor wanted to put a thumbprint on eternity. Like your brands, Aiko says, but with better ethics. Debatable, Lin smiles. A temple was also a financial instrument. Once you give land to the monastery, it's off the tax roll. Kings glowed, treasuries thinned. A beautiful contradiction. Gold leaf on the roof, a hollow under the floor. He's aware of the lecture tone and softens, pointing out the window. Children run across a field in school uniforms the color of fragments of sky. Aiko watches them as if their running contains a theorem about being alive. In Bagan's day, Lin continues, the plain filled with builders. Craftsmen set bricks in stories. Monks copied the Pali canon until syllables turned into seeds. Merchants ferried spice and silk. The Bamar kings ruled from the center. The Mande carried Buddhism up from the coasts. Shan horsemen held the high passes like teeth guarding a tongue. We say one kingdom, but it was always an orchestra that argued. And you? Aiko asks lightly. Where were you? Writing, he says, surprising himself. Counting, aligning sun and door so you could get a light beam in the inner chamber for a few minutes each year. A pen can be a sword. A calendar can kill. I was a scribe, a courier, a shadow that learned how to speak like the man who cast it. Like a ghostwriter. Exactly, he says. Except the ghost was a king. The bus rocks, the curtains agree. Aiko waits, not pressing. He can feel the old room again, the polished palm leaf manuscripts, the lacquer bowls drying in lines like chess pieces mid-game. He hears his own voice, and he hears another writing inside it, like a second current under the river's surface, strong enough to move a boat you think is anchored. The king loved appearances, Lin says softly. All kings do. He loved the way the sun gilded a spire in late afternoon, and the way a courtier gilded a sentence before it reached his ear. He rode out to see the new stupas and the old fields, and didn't always see how one paid for the other. But he was not a cartoon. He feared, he laughed, he remembered names. He had sons. Plural. Plural. Lin echoes. And suns are weather. They change the air. By the time they reach Pie, the river is fully awake, barges trailing long rumors of teak. They climb the hill to Shwesendal, where the breeze turns the heat tender. From here, the Irrawaddy looks like it knows every secret the kingdom ever told itself. Here, Lin says, resting his hand on the railing, is where the story begins to tremble. From the north, riders we called winged Mongol scouts first, then armies that wore distance like armor. The year people like to carve into the story is 1277. But stories don't break in one place, they fray. And you were there, Aiko says. It's not a question, it's the plain conclusion of someone who has decided to trust the map as drawn. I carried orders. I read reports aloud because the king preferred voices to ink. I counted the jars of rice, watched the tax lands slip like sand underwater. The monasteries grow fat, the palace grow thin, and I designed festivals to make the famine look like patience. That part, I am not proud of. Survival is also a grammar, Aiko says. Maybe, Lin says, but it conjugates into regret. They walk the terraces in silence, the river throwing back a sun already certain of itself. A local family asks for a photo. Aiko bows. The children giggle, and Lin feels the gears of the day settle into an arrangement that makes a music he didn't expect, the major key of company. At a tea stall below the hill, Aiko touches the sweating glass of her drink. You said the king had sons, and weather changes. It does, Lin says. A storm is only wind until it finds your roof. They take an early bus to Nyangyu and wake into a sunrise that has rehearsed for 1,000 years. Hot air balloons rise like meditations let loose. The light lifts the plane, one tower at a time, as if turning pages gently so the book won't crack at the spine. This is the moment the postcards promise, and then still somehow fail to deliver. They look like prayers, Aiko says, pointing to the balloons as they sway out toward the river. They are, Lin says, prayers that obey physics. They hire e-bikes and let the dust draw them a map. Between Ananda's white calm and Dhamma Yangyi's red gravity, the plain arranges its own arguments. Everywhere doorways that convene light, corridors that keep cool, the names carved inside them. In one small shrine, a farmer has set fresh marigolds, and a gecko, master of punctuation, clicks twice. Lin leads Aiko under a low arch that smells of old rain and bat sleep. He talks, but not like a guide. He chooses the ancient present tense. We built as if piety were a ladder, he says, fingertips grazing a seam of fired clay. But devotion is also administration. Land gifted to monasteries meant fewer hands on the king's purse. Local lords grew pious on paper, and powerful in fact. The Monday brought lineages of learning. The Shan held the heights. Our Bamar court wove it together and called it harmony. But harmonies need rehearsal, and war is noisy. He points through a slit of window to where the plain trembles with heat that hasn't even arrived yet. When the riders came, they didn't bring apocalypse. They brought arithmetic. The cost of keeping the walls against them was more than the cost of letting the walls remember they were clay. Some of us said, bend, then stand up again. Some of us said, never bend. And you? Aiko asks. I said whatever sounded like courage when fear was the only language, Lin answers. Which is to say, I said many things and meant fewer. They sit on a low step where hundreds of feet have taught the bricks humility. Lin takes off his cap and looks like a boy who has found his father's letters in a trunk and is reading them in a light too bright for his eyes. The king, he says, and the word is water over stone, rounding itself. He wrote out less in those days. He asked for reports. He asked for hymns. If he admitted fear, he did it with a joke about the weather. The north was a rumor, until the rumor set tents on our fields. Then it was a fact. We fought, because that is what kingdoms do when the counting ends. He smiles without humor. We like to say, Mongol invasion, as if it were a single blow, a neat headline. History is never neat. First the scouts, then the demands, then the war, then the stops and starts of retreat and return. Meanwhile, earthquakes that unstitched towers, floods that changed the river's mind, monks who insisted their ledgers were holy, lords who found that holiness is a good shield for land. Aiko threads her fingers together, listening. He can feel her attention like shade. It makes the heat kind. You asked about sons, he says. The king had several. One held the south like a promise. Another held the palace like a mirror. Mirrors are dangerous. They show you yourself when you most want a map. And you were close? Aiko ventures. Close enough to carry sealed orders at night, Lin says. Close enough to learn the timbre of the king's anger and the silence that came after it. A silence that meant the same thing as winter. Close enough to be there when a father looks at a son and sees not a future, but an omen. They ride to a mound where the grass grows with that particular obedience of grass in old places. Over the plain, someone is taking wedding photos. Red dress, gold embroidery, a democracy of smiles. The balloons have drifted toward the horizon. The towers look taller for it. Do you believe in reincarnation? Aiko asks suddenly, cautious as if she were asking whether he believes in debt. I believe in memory, Lin says, which is the same question with less certainty. And if you remembered being the king? I don't, he says. Then, to his own surprise, not exactly. I remember being his shadow long enough that the sun had trouble telling us apart. Aiko nods, as if the distinction pleases a scholar in her pocket. Shadows are honest. They obey angles. They also vanish at noon, Lin says. They spend the late afternoon at Ananda, where whitewash cools the eye and the symmetry is so humane you forget it is symmetry. A novice explains carefully, earnestly how a beam of light once pierced a corridor at certain days of the year. His teacher nods, letting the boy own the knowledge. Lin watches and thinks of the calendars he drew, and the way a line on a palm leaf could bend a day into beauty. At dusk, they climb a legal mound. The rangers are strict about roofs these days. The sun performs the old trick of making ruins look like a decision rather than an accident. Aiko's shoulder brushes his. Neither of them moves. The sky releases the day inch by inch, the way a hand lets go of a promise without breaking it. Tomorrow, Lin says, we ride to the western edge. There's a stupa with a fallen crown. From there, the plain looks unbreakable. And then? Aiko asks. Then we go to Prome, he says. A city that remembers a night I've spent my whole life rehearsing how not to tell. The first star lifts into view, small and insolent. Somewhere behind them a child laughs the way bells might laugh if they weren't so religious. Lin feels the story turning toward the place where it will hurt, and for the first time in years he does not turn away. The western edge of the plain looks, at first glance, like a sentence trailing off politely low scrub, a cart path, a stupa that never learned how to be impressed by itself. The crown on this stupa has slipped inward, scalloping the top like a broken bowl. Someone has tied a strip of saffron cloth to a twig. It flutters with the kind of optimism that refuses to check the forecast. This one, Lin says, was never anyone's favorite, which is why I like it. Aiko takes a photo and then doesn't take 3 more. She has learned that certain places want you to look with your eyes. The air smells of warm brick and faint hibiscus. A pair of goats negotiate the steps and discover that enlightenment is a patch of shade. In the high days, Lin continues, palm on the old clay. We built as if the sun would never learn about winter. The court counted towers like merchants count ships. Bamar princes married Monday princesses and called it peace. Shan chiefs were offered titles with vowels stretched long like a smile you can't quite trust. It worked until we started believing that working means can't break. He speaks of the Ananda builders whose plans were so precise that rumor promoted them to angels, of Dama-Yangyi, red as a closed fist, and rumored to be mortared with cruelty, of the lacquer workshops where bowls dried glossy as a lake without a wrinkle. He tells Aiko how donor stamps were pressed into bricks, names made into prayer, and how lands gifted to monasteries slowly migrated off the tax rolls like small birds finding a warmer branch. The court shone brighter for a time because gold leaf is cooperative. Rice is less so. Did no one object? Aiko asks. Objecting is an art, Lin says. Too loud and you're a traitor. Too soft and you're part of the chant. We wrote memos that tried to sound like piety and still add up to numbers. We warned that a treasury cannot live on adjectives. The warnings read well in the archive. They did not travel quickly through the walls. And the king? He liked the good story. He also liked to win, Lin says. And for a heartbeat, his voice has a shadow. He thought a good story would eventually win. It does in the long run. Kingdoms live in the short run. They sit a while, and the day pries open its hot hand. A cart passes, the driver half asleep, the wheel squeaking like a polite complaint. Aiko drinks warm water as if it were a choice. Lin writes a line with his fingertip on the brick dust and watches the wind erase it. There was a prophecy, he says, because there is always a prophecy. If the great red temple Dama-Yangyi were ever perfectly finished, the kingdom would fall. So men worked with a zeal that dared fate to blink. When the brickwork went bad, they patched it with rumor. When the corners refused a perfect right angle, we invented grace. Aiko smiles. Art history lectures talk like that. You sound like a professor. God help us, Lin says, and they laugh to keep the weight from pressing an unnecessary bruise. But the laughter has a small ache under it, the way a song you love carries the day you first heard it, whether you invite that day back to the room or not. They ride until the e-bike decides it is the lazier of the two. Lin kneels to fiddle with the battery connection. Aiko kneels beside him, as if the machine might be tempted to blush and behave. A coil of wire gives up its sulk. The bike purrs. Aiko claps once. The sound is a bright pebble in a deep well. At noon, Lin says, squinting, we hide. There's a tea shop under a neem tree, where the cups taste faintly of smoke. The owner's daughter will ask if we're married. You will tell her we're students. She will approve because students are always romantic, in theory. All this has happened before, Aiko says. Everything has, Lin answers, except what comes next. In the shade, the world contracts to a radius of 15 feet. The cups are as promised, the daughter as direct. The neem leaf shadows move like a soft clock no one believes in. Lin's phone finds a thin bar of service, which is simply a way for the present to wag its finger. The client wants the deck earlier. The dentist calls with the patience of a professional who has renamed nagging as care. Lin types 2 lines and deletes 3. Your work? Aiko asks. It's there, he says. It will still be there when the sun surrenders. If I type now, I will say yes to something that needs a maybe. You can tell them you're with an old friend, Aiko says. Gaze a little sideways. Memory researcher. That might be too honest, Lin says, and the line feels good in his mouth. Their knees touch under the table and do not hurry to become strangers. He pays. Aiko thanks the owner in halting Burmese that earns a blessing for effort alone. On the way back through the dust, the fallen crown stupa tosses a small reflection of light, the way certain people in certain rooms toss you a question you'll be answering for years. Tomorrow we go to the river, Lin says. From there to Prome. And from Prom? Aiko asks. He considers pretending he doesn't know the answer. That would be kinder and therefore less true. From Prome, he says, we open a door that shouldn't have been built. They board a slow boat whose age is counted in songs. The river decides their speed. Women sell fruit in baskets that appear and vanish with the choreography of kindness. Aiko sketches quick lines that understand better than photos how a day sits on a man's shoulders. Lin watches the banks roll by and names trees with the confidence of someone who learned them before school taught him to distrust memory. The Mongols, Aiko prompts, when the boat settles into an hour of pure patience. Came like weather, Lin says. First a chill in the air, then a cloud you can ignore until you can't. They demanded tribute, messengers sent to frighten more than inform. We had our pride, we also had our accounts. Pride looks marvelous in carvings. Accounts are not very photogenic. He explains how 1277 became the clean nail on which chroniclers hang a messier garment. How skirmishes taught the court the shape of a larger hand. How 1283-85 put weight behind rumor. And 1287 left a date-shaped scar. He talks about the riders who wore the long mile like extra armor. The taxes that could not be collected because the best and pious lands belonged to structures that produced blessings more readily than silver, the local lords, whose banners began to elaborate themselves, until a map looked like a room with too many flags in it. The Monday, he says, held the coastlines and the liturgical keys. The Shan held the heights and the fast horses. The Bamar sat in the middle and called it the world. Sometimes the orchestra plays the same song by accident, sometimes by decree. We tried both. And the sons? Aiko asks. The south was held in strong hands, Lin says. A prince called Tihatu governed Prome Piai, like a man who understands that a hinge is as important as a door. He was his father's hope and his father's weather, both at once. Another son held the palace like a clean mirror. Mirrors don't lie, but they don't help you pack for war. You were still the courier? And the calendar, Lin says. I found the auspicious days for processions that said more than our armies could. I wrote the letters that pretended to be replies, and the replies that pretended to be commands. I watched the king's appetite shrink to cravings. Cravings? For praise, Lin says, not unkindly, for the old feeling of being what the light chooses to gild. He could be brave. You know, That is not the part history keeps. The boat noses the current and finds a compromise. A boy on the bank waves a green branch, and the boat waves back because everyone understands theater. Aiko lets the water teach her a slower way to breathe. You don't speak like a man who hates his king, she says. I don't, Lin says. If I hated him, the story would be simpler. Simpler stories help you sleep. They do not help you wake. They reach Paye at a patient hour. The city wears its history like a shawl that has learned to be both garment and map. In the market, a woman sells paper umbrellas splashed with flowers that never existed, which is to say, perfect flowers. Aiko holds one to the light. Its ribs make a sunflower on the ground. They climb to the old wall, where the view finds the river and refuses to apologize for repeating itself. Lin touches the brick, the way a doctor touches a wrist. Reading, not repairing. Here, he says, a father taught a son how to say the word king without wincing. And here a son taught a father what the word king costs. Aiko's hand finds his without having to ask anyone. He lets the contact stand like a curtain that knows how to be both open and closed. What happened? She says. First, the messengers, Lin replies. Then the meetings that last past midnight. Then the decisions that come home to you dressed as consequences. The court split into men who wanted to pay to live and men who wanted to fight to live, which is really only a smaller argument about how one defines live. Tihatu held the hinge. The king held the key. Neither trusted the door. And you? I walked between them, Lin says. I carried fear safely, the way you carry a candle through a dark house. Then one night. He stops. Aiko does not press. The river gives them a wind that smells of mud and the polite rot that makes gardens possible. The old wall warms under a sun that has performed this trick since before the first stone learned what a line is. Tomorrow night, Lin says at last, if you wish, I will tell you how a cup can be a kingdom. Aiko nods. Tomorrow night, she says. In her pocket, her return flight lives like a minor chord. She does not mention it, neither does he, yet the chord hums. They do not rush the day. They let the hours stack without nails. In the afternoon they visit a monastery school, where a blackboard declares in chalk that kindness is a language anyone can learn. A monk with a face like an unrumpled bedsheet shows Aiko how to hold a palm leaf manuscript without rushing it. Lin watches and thinks about how many of his days have been violent to paper. As dusk considers its options, they walk the older quarter where a gate still thinks it is guarding something. Lin pauses beneath it. The brick smells exactly like it did. He does not say when. He does not have to. The palace, he says, in those weeks, was a theater that auditioned endings. We had advisors who heard the word Mongol and turned it into a synonym for destiny. We had generals who believed that a clean death is better than a dirty life. We had treasurers who tried to teach arithmetic to men who had graduated from gold. And the king's sons? Aiko asks. Thihathu, Lin says, sent letters faster than riders should have been able to ride. The palace praised his efficiency and disliked his conclusions. He wished to make terms. The king wished to make history. The other son polished the mirrors. I listened to the rooms thick with incense, thick with men who wanted adjectives to be tactics. He tells her about the night the court gathered, and the map was spread, its river lines a little too clean, to be honest. About the monk invited to speak for heaven, and the general invited to speak for earth. About the silence that came after both speeches, which said everything both had tried not to say. He speaks of a corridor, where he waited with a letter sealed and a second letter unsealed, in case the first answer hated itself on the way across the tiles. Did you believe you could win? Aiko asks. I believed in exit strategies, Lin says. That is not the same as victory. It is a kind of hope with a smaller hat. They sit on a low step inside the gate as the light performs its last accurate act. A boy dribbles a ball that was once a better ball. A dog chooses a patch of ground and forgives it for not being heaven. The cup, Aiko prompts softly. In Chronicles, Lin says, eyes on the old stone. They will tell you the year 1287 and the place Promé and the manner poison. They will argue about which son, about what kind of drink, about who else was in the room. They will wear certainty like a shawl until the breeze lifts it. And you? I was there, Lin says. I stood by the door, the way a shadow stands by a man who is deciding whether to move. The king had fled the center. He had learned to distinguish fear from caution and named them both prudence to make the courtiers less nervous. In the smaller house, the walls were honest. They smelled of wood, not power. Thihathu came in like a weather report. Direct, dangerous, insisting you bring in the laundry. Aiko's fingers tighten around his. The street's small noises make a quiet that is not weak but designed. They spoke not as father and son, but as men, Lin says. The court had devoured the grammar that allows families to live. Tihatu said, preserve what can be preserved. The king said, preserve the crown. Tihatu said, crowns are heavier than boats. The king said, I am the river. Then someone offered a cup. What was in it? Aiko asks. Because she is a scholar, and because she is a friend. Agreement, Lin says, which can be bitter. He does not describe the face. He will not. This is not because he is afraid of sorrow, but because sorrow is not a spectacle. He only says, the cup was lifted, the room held its breath, and then, like all rooms, forgot to keep holding it. The king slept. We went outside where the night had been waiting to be named. Aiko presses her forehead to his shoulder, a gesture on the delicate frontier between comfort and prayer. Lin's breath finds the same rhythm as the evening insects. Was it murder? Aiko asks. It was a decision, Lin says. Murder is a decision with fewer signatures. And you, she asks, what did you do? I counted the lamps, Lin says. I remembered which bricks were loose in the path. I began to write a history that would not choose a single villain, because that choice is always a small lie that keeps you warm. They walk back to the river very slowly. In the hotel lobby, a television murmurs a soap opera so sincere it almost becomes history. Aiko's hand lingers in his, as if it were a promise written in pencil. He does not ask about her flight. She does not offer the date. Both know that dates are cups too, and sometimes the hand that lifts them has already decided. Tomorrow, Lin says, we go home by the long road. The country is different when you carry a night like that in your pocket. Memory researcher, Aiko says, trying to put brightness over the bruise. Professional overthinker, Lin answers, and the lobby light forgives them for humor. When they part at the elevator, he thinks of the gate, how it keeps standing even after the door has forgotten its hinges. He sleeps without dreams, because the day has done all the dreaming on his behalf, and somewhere upriver, a long-ago city takes a breath and lets it out like a man who has decided to live without an empire. They go south by a road that has practiced being a history book. Mile markers like footnotes, tea shops like citations, the river appearing and withdrawing the way memory does when you stop forcing it. The bus hums. A grandmother unwraps a banana leaf parcel and insists Aiko take half. Kindness translates itself before grammar has a chance. We didn't fall in one night, Lin says, as fields fold themselves into the window. After the cup, the empire did what empires do. When the center misplaces its name, it remembered it was made of places. My insane, Taungu, Prome, Martaban, banners started using their outside voices. Shan chiefs in the hills, Aiko says, tracing the road on the foggy glass with a fingertip. Monday polities along the coast. And Bamar towns in the middle, negotiating with whoever tomorrow turns out to be, Lin replies. Historians argue about how long the Mongols actually held anything here. A season? A few years? An occupation that was mostly a rumor with soldiers attached. But even a rumor, if it's heavy enough, dents the table. The dent remains. He tells her how Bagan's monks carried texts downriver, how Theravada did not vanish with the court, but reseated itself like a guest who understands households better than kings. He explains that the brick inscriptions did a strange, generous thing. They stabilized language. In naming donors and dates, they gave Burmese a spine that would outlast the crowns that paid for it. A quiet fact, easily missed, that nevertheless threads a people through a broken century. "What did you do?" Aiko asks. "I learned to be small," Lin says. "Courier work becomes safer when maps have more edges than centers. I wrote letters for men who called themselves governors, and for abbots who called themselves custodians of the world. Sometimes I meant it. Sometimes I merely folded the paper neatly. They stop at a roadside shrine, a whitewashed cube with a bell that asks rather than commands. The bell's note hangs in the heat and refuses to be bored. Aiko ties a thin thread to a nail, the way she was taught in Kyoto as a girl visiting a mountain temple. Lin doesn't ask what she prays. He knows that asking can drain a prayer faster than time can. "The last time I came down this road," he says, "I carried a letter to a Shan Sabwa. I suspected it would be intercepted, and I wrote it to survive interception. The trick was to let both men think the other was being flattered. I am not proud of that sentence. I am proud of how beautiful I made it sound. Beauty is sometimes how we apologize to truth," Aiko says gently. Lin smiles without moving his mouth. His eyes do it for him. On the bus again, the sky goes briefly the color of hammered brass, and then collapses into evening, like a stagehand pulling a curtain with practiced hands. The driver puts on a song about roads and the way they carry the names of the people who left. Nobody complains. "Where are we going?" Aiko asks softly. "Home," Lin says, "which is to say Yangon, which is to say where a modern life has been sitting very politely while we've been away." "And after home?" she says, meaning something she doesn't name. "After home," Lin says, "we answer a question that has been patient long enough." Yangon breathes them back in as if nothing strange has happened at all, which is one of the city's oldest talents. Neon signs resume their nightly thesis. Curry houses perfect the argument they started at noon. The street dogs vote silently on whether you belong. The vote passes, 1004-2. Lin's apartment greets him with the exact smell of last week's laundry. Aiko has a room near the lake. The receptionist learns to say her name with a smile that believes in syllables. They meet at the National Museum because you are allowed to be sentimental if you disguise it as learning. The Hall of Payu artifacts is quiet enough to hear shoes choose their futures. A palm leaf manuscript sits beneath glass, its letters cut with that ancient accuracy that makes time blush. Bagan didn't keep everything, Lin says, but it kept the habit of keeping. These scripts like bamboo scaffolds. Empires fall, scaffolds go on to help with other roofs. "Your voice changes here," Aiko says. "You sound proud." "I am," Lin admits. "Not of the king, not of the cup, of the people who figured out how to keep singing when the choir director left." He shows her a lacquer bowl from Bagan, black so confident it looks like it made night and merely rented it to the sky. He tells her the Monday court at Hanthawadi would later gather teachers and poems the way the sea gathers light. How Renaissance is a quiet word that doesn't like trumpets, and yet here it is, 100 years after endings tried to audition as permanent. "In Chronicles," he says, "you can see the arguments we made with ourselves dressed up as the arguments we made with our neighbors. Who taxes what? Who bows when? But if you listen under the ink, you can hear the kitchen. Who ate? Who taught children? Who fixed the pots? The empire is a theater. The country is a house. When the theater closes, the house feeds you." Aiko stands before a model stupa and bends so the light lays down across her hair, like a hand blessing a student. "And the house forgave the theater?" she asks. "Eventually," Lin says. "Or at least we learned not to confuse applause with dinner." They walk back toward Shwedagon because neither of them believes in repeating scenes exactly, but both believe in seeing what the light is doing tonight. The steps are warm under bare feet. Candles multiply, without needing permission. Every wick is a conversation about scale. I have 3 days, Aiko says, as if offering him a number he might accept as a friend. Then we'll make them wide, Lin says. A monk with a face like a map of lakes speaks to them in English that belongs to no single teacher. You carry a story, he tells Lin, as if he has been reading over the man's shoulder. Say it well, and it will stop carrying you. Aiko squeezes Lin's hand in the moment it would have been too easy to joke. Lin bows to the monk, and in the bow is a small surrender that feels like a tool instead of a wound. On a street that sells books that have tried almost everything, Lin knows a clerk who doesn't mind opening the back room if you promise not to take photographs that pretend secrets are trophies. The back room smells exactly right. Old paper, a patient mildew, a benevolent fatigue. These, the clerk says, laying down a bundle of palm leaves, come from a monastery that had more faith than money. Carefully, please. Aiko glows in the way scholars do when they are allowed to hold something that forgot to learn how to die. Lin translates a line here and there, the script rising off the leaf like a well-behaved flock. What did you write? Aiko asks. When you were the courier, the calendar, the ghost hand? Victories, when we needed them, Lin says. Plans, when we had none. Apologies that sounded like parables. The truth, whenever I could hide it in a metaphor no one wanted to murder. He turns a leaf, and a pressed petal falls. So thin, it's almost a verb. He doesn't touch it. He lets it exist. I wrote the order that pulled men from their fields to build an eastern wall we never used. He says, the words as even as a table. I chose an auspicious day for a procession at a time when the rice needed cutting. I wrote a love letter for a prince who used it to buy a treaty. You were saving a house with theater again, Aiko says. Not accusing, only noticing. Yes, Lin says. And sometimes the theater paid the rent. They leave with nothing but thanks, which is correct. Outside, afternoon rains begin with that Yangon directness. They duck into a tea shop whose glass displays are confident in their pastry theories. On the wall, a calendar girl from 3 years ago still believes in June. My flight, Aiko says. I thought I could not think about it, but modernity is very efficient. I know a ferry, Lin answers, as if ferries solved it. We can ride to Dala and watch the city remember it is made of water. They do. The ferry smells of rust and maybe oranges. Boys sell birds you can set free for a fee, which is a theological sentence disguised as commerce. Aiko does not buy a bird. She watches the gulls pretend the river is theirs and admires their persistence. At Promé, she says finally, you didn't say goodbye to the king. I don't know what word I used, Lin says. It might have been forgive, but I think it was carry. I have been carrying ever since. And now? I would like to finish the story and put it somewhere that isn't my chest, Lin says, not bravely or dramatically, but as if he is returning a library book on time. Aiko leans on the rail, hair whipped into small flags by the wind. Then we'll finish it, she says, and then we'll see what stories behave like when they're not trying to live our lives for us. On the way back, a street dog sleeps inside a rectangle of sun as if he rented it by the hour. The city makes room for the dog without legislating it. Lin notices, and the noticing is a kind of permission he didn't know he had needed. They spend their second to last day the way good days teach you to slow in the morning, precise in the afternoon, unafraid of evening. At Botatong they stand by a relic chamber whose geometry is a hug. At Sule they walk the roundabout, the way you walk a prayer wheel that forgot to be vertical. In a side street a boy fixes shoes with a needle that is both tool and metaphor. Lin buys the repair he doesn't quite need. Bagan at high noon, he says as they sit with sugarcane juice. We should honor it too, not just the falling. There was a century when we learned to carve thoughts into walls in a way that made the mind taller. There were days when the river brought tin, lacquer, joss, and stories, and we learned to sort them without breaking the people who carried them. The Ananda architects taught the sun to behave like a monk. The inscriptions taught memory to read itself. That counts. It does, Aiko says. Sometimes, the past asks us to love it at its best, not only interrogate it at its worst. And sometimes, loving at its best is how you get the strength to interrogate the worst, Lin answers. They walk until the city has turned the corner into golden hour, a color Yangon invented and lends out freely. At the park, by the lake, they sit on a bench that votes yes to their presence. Lin's phone knocks at his attention. An email with a subject line that has perfected the art of polite urgency. He opens it. A campaign that wants to tie a heritage brand to a story about resilience. He can do it in a weekend if he turns his days back into equipment. The money is not small. The deadline is not kind. Will you take it? Aiko asks. In the old days, Lin says, I would have turned empire into sentence and sent it out the gate. And now? He drafts. Thank you for thinking of me. I won't be able to give this the care it deserves this week. If the timeline has breath in it, we can talk Monday. He sends. The city does not explode. The lake continues being a lake, as if it had suspected all along that his answer would be reasonable. That's a small thing, Lin says, half apology. A small hinge moves a big door, Aiko replies, and her smile is the neatest proof. They climb the hill to Shwedagon one more time, because certain roads desire elegy. The platform spreads out in its quiet republic of light. A child toddles, falls, does not cry. A woman in a blue longyi ties her wish to a branch that has already agreed to hold it. The bell strikes, and for a moment the entire city keeps time with a sound it cannot own. I have to go, Aiko says, finally saying the sentence that has been practicing behind her teeth. I know, Lin says, because he does. I'll be back, she adds, an unnecessary clause that the knight accepts anyway. I will be here, Lin says, which isn't exactly a promise, but knows how to behave like one. They stand a long while without arranging their faces into anything particular. When they walk down the steps, the marble is cool, and the air somehow remembers the river. Aiko slips her hand into his. It fits with that practical beauty usually reserved for tools that are used every day. Tomorrow, she says. Tomorrow, he answers. The word has two shadows, the flight and the after. On the last full morning they give themselves to slowness, as if it were a teacher with good chalk. Yangon plays its familiar chords, bus horns, that sound like arguments between cousins. The citrus-sweet edge of tea, a market that knows the difference between noise and music. Aiko wants to see the bookstalls by Pansodon again. Lin obliges so readily, it feels like the city decided this for them. They stand at a table where history has been priced fairly. A pamphlet with a torn corner insists in English from the 1962nd that the future is nothing if not cooperative. A Burmese almanac from a year that refused to be brief offers auspicious days for planting and marrying, which, in their way, are the same practice. Aiko skims with the quick hunger of someone who eats knowledge neatly. Lin watches her mouth shape silent vowels and thinks, not for the first time, that listening is also a craft. Bagan isn't a tragedy, he says as they walk toward a tea shop that trusts rattan chairs. Not only, it's also a literacy project that learned to survive kings. The inscriptions, all those donors and dates, taught the language to trust itself. Even when the court fell, Theravada didn't. It moved house. He catches himself and laughs. Listen to me. I sound like a poster. It's a good poster, Aiko says. And anyway, scholars still argue whether the Mongols held anything in Burma for more than the time it takes a rumor to become a customs policy. Exactly, Lin says. Historians debate the intensity of the occupation and whether internal fiscal strain mattered more than cavalry. The answer is yes. They sit with sugarcane juice that slides into the day like a minor miracle. A college student asks to practice English and leaves them with a blessing disguised as a thank you. The student's notebook has a carefully written heading. Research methods. Lin, traitor to his inbox, leans into a happiness that doesn't audition for anything. In the afternoon, they go to Kyaoktaki, where the giant reclines with the composure of someone who is truly between breaths. Women lay petals. Men count quietly. Aiko watches the feet, each symbol a tiny theology. Lin translates only when asked, which is not often. The light begins to behave like honey. The city rehearses evening. Tell me something not in the books, Aiko says. Dama Yang Yi, Lin answers. The red-fist people whisper that a cruel king sealed bricks with crime. But if you run your hand along the wall, the mortar is the same tired lime as everywhere. Legends are the way a city metabolizes guilt. And yet, he adds, smiling, every guide knows the rumor is true in how usefully it explains things. Scholars still debate whether the labor there was punishment or mere pride. Perhaps both. And the monks? Aiko asks. Never monolithic, Lin says. Some greedy land is a persuasive sermon. Some delicate copying the Pali Canon until their wrists ached and time bowed to ink. I owe them most of what I can say now without lying. Evening chooses them for company. They sit on the Kondogi boardwalk until the lake decides they are part of its reflection. The night vendors fluff their fried dough like pillows for dreams. Aiko's shoulder leans on his like a clause that wears its grammar lightly. What would you change, she asks, if you could carry one law back through time? Taxes, Lin says promptly, and they both laugh at the indecency of a romantic answer that belongs to accountants. I'd tether piety to responsibility. Land gifted to monasteries would still glow, but it wouldn't vanish from the common purse. Altars are hungry in ways roads cannot match. Also, I would ask kings to ride out more. Looking at the map only from the center makes every distance a flattery. Kings don't like being told that. Aiko smiles. No one does, Lin admits, which is why history is necessary. It disagrees with your favorite self-image. He almost tells her then that he loves her in that careful, unshowy way this city reserves for its oldest structures. Instead, he says, let me see you off tomorrow. I'd like that, Aiko answers quickly. The relief is mutual and clean. They walk without a plan until the plan becomes obvious. Shwedagon again, because certain places are hinges rather than rooms. The platform unfurls. The lamps practice infinity. A monk smiles with every tooth. A child tries on a prayer like a hat and decides it fits. They light a small candle and name it nothing. The smoke writes kindly on the air and forgives them for leaving most sentences unfinished. 2 more things, Aiko says. 1. I want to ride the dawn balloons one more time, even if only from the ground. And 2. Take me somewhere the tourists miss. Lin nods, already assembling a map between ribs. Then we'll steal a morning, he says. And a ruin. They leave before the birds have decided whether speaking is worth it. A driver who claims to have memorized the city's coffee by scent delivers them to the airport gate with time to spare, and then, after a wink that is almost a bow, delivers them to Nyangyu by the next dawn. Modernity and ancientness collude when it suits them. The balloons lift like disciplined sighs. Lin doesn't talk. Aiko doesn't ask him to. They ride out to a low place, where a nameless stupa leans into a tamarind tree, as if asking it to remember something the brick keeps forgetting. No postcard claims it, no timeline defends it. A farmer nearby cups water onto small green things that have decided to try. This one, Lin says, is honest. It was never finished. No one pretends otherwise. He kneels and presses his palm to the brick. We finished too much, he says, meaning a century rather than a building. We turned faith into land titles, and land titles into a language the treasury couldn't translate. Scholars still argue about which pressure carried the most weight: war from the north, wealth drift to the monasteries, or climate's quiet betrayals? The answer, again, is yes. Aiko kneels beside him. The ground is still cool. The sun has not yet remembered its old arrogance. If the cup were offered now, she asks, not to tempt, but to measure. I would set it down, Lin says. Not because I am brave, because I am tired of letting fear call itself prudence. She nods as if he has handed her an instrument she has always wanted to learn, then reaches into her pocket and produces a small omamori white cloth, a fine gold thread, the easiest kind of spell. For journeys, she says, in case you ever travel, without moving. He accepts it the way you accept an old truth told in a new language. From his own pocket he pulls a brick stamp, a little clay square with a lotus that thinks it's a compass. Replica, he says, and winces at the word. A story you can hold. It belonged to a donor whose name we cannot trace. The lotus points in all directions. I am still working out how to imitate that. Thank you, Aiko says, not performing gratitude, but wearing it correctly. She hides the small thing as if protecting the larger thing it means. They sit until the heat becomes the kind that suggests shade as a philosophy. Tell me the worst thing, Aiko says, because love deserves accuracy. I taught a festival to look like courage, Lin answers. It bought us time by spending someone else's bread. I wrote the schedule of generosity while the granaries learned subtraction. I called it uniting the realm. The realm did not feel united. And the best thing? I wrote a letter that stopped a hillside from burning, he says. Once. Aiko smiles. It's enough. The balloons chair the plane and then drift politely away. Lin feels the hinge of the day arrive. He stands and brushes dust from his knees, the way you brush crumbs from a table after a long story well told. Let's be on time, he says. Your flight is a small king today. We should not make it nervous. Airports are honest about endings. They keep their floors reflective so you can see how you stand when you pretend to be casual. Yangon International hums a professional hum. Aiko's bag is so light, it looks like humility. Lin's pockets are heavier than they were yesterday. They sit with paper cups and the soft tyranny of a digital clock. On the wall, a destination board lists cities that have agreed temporarily to behave. Aiko looks at her hands. Lin keeps an eye on any objects that might turn into metaphors without warning. I have to ask, she says finally, do you forgive him? The king? Lin says. Yes, which is not the same as absolving. I forgive the man who was afraid and who confused his fear with the crown. I do not forgive the system that taught him those were the only options. And the son? I forgive him too, Lin says, though the sentence requires a breath before it sits. At night, a hinge thinks it is a door. He did what a hinge knows how to do, swing, so the door can move. He drank bitterness, so the structure could imagine stability. Scholars will still debate whether he killed his father or saved the realm. Both arguments are footnotes to grief. And you, Aiko says, can you forgive the courier who wrote the pretty lies? That is the work, Lin answers. To love the tools I had without loving the harm I made with them. To write now in a way that refuses to be a bribe. She touches the omamori through cloth. He touches the small absence in his pocket where the brick stamp used to be. A loudspeaker practices an apology in 3 languages and succeeds in 2. The minutes shuffle their feet. When you come to Tokyo, she says, we'll sit under a cedar that knows how to count centuries. I'll show you a museum catalog with a page I argue with every year. You will like disagreeing in a country that makes disagreement polite. When you come back, he replies, I'll take you upriver to a monastery where boys learn to let syllables be boats. Then we'll walk a field and watch farmers teach the future to eat. Her boarding call climbs the air. The quiet that follows is not empty but arranged. They stand like people who have made a neat decision and left room for weather. Aiko lifts her bag. The story, she says. You put it somewhere? In the river, Lin says. It knows how to carry weight without drowning it. They do not kiss, which would be a worse kind of lie than any he used to write. They do not promise dates that cannot know their own weather. They touch foreheads briefly, the way some peoples greet saints and others greet children. It is enough, and more than enough. She goes. The terminal swallows her kindly. Lin watches the door she chose until watching turns into learning. Outside, Yangon rehearses for rain. Work returns with its tidy hunger. The brand team wants a resilience narrative that tastes like authenticity but chews like sugar. Lin opens the document and sees in it the old court in a new suit. Donors who want the roof gilded and the books quiet. He writes a line, he deletes it. He writes another that refuses to bribe. In the evenings, he volunteers at a brick conservation workshop, run by people who have discovered that glue and memory are cousins. He learns to mix lime that doesn't sulk. He learns that patience has recipes. The foreman, a woman whose laugh could hold up a porch, teaches him the right pressure for an old surface, which turns out to be the same pressure a friend needs when you are trying to repair a decade. A letter arrives from Pie. A local teacher has collected folktales about the fall of Bagan and wants help making a pamphlet for her students. Lin takes the bus with a notebook and the kind of excited hunger that makes vendors generous. They sit in a classroom where a fan tries to teach the air a song. The stories are contradictory in ways that make them trustworthy. In one, the teacher says, the stupa was cursed. In another, the king was cursed. In a third, the curse is just what we call a series of bad arithmetic choices. Scholars still debate which is truest, Lin says. And that's good. It means the story is still working. They print the pamphlet on a machine that complains in the right places. The children read with the seriousness children reserve for things adults have been careless with. A boy raises his hand and asks if the Mongols rode elephants. Lin says no and yes in a way that leaves the boy pleased. No, they were horsemen. Yes, the word Mongol is how we learn to name fear that comes from far away and moves quickly. Back in Yangon, he rearranges his desk so it faces east. Morning enters without negotiating and lands on the keys of his keyboard like a decision that a kinder person already made. He writes a letter to a client, gently turning down a campaign that wants a tragic past as a garnish. He writes a note to Aiko with a photo of the teacher's pamphlet. He sends both, without editing the apology, into a joke. The replies, one polite disappointment and one delighted exclamation, arrive like twin birds choosing the same branch. At night he dreams once of Burmese gate. It is still a gate. It has learned to be a door only when asked. He wakes without the old weight in his chest. The room feels correctly mortal. He makes tea and watches the kettle refuse to rush. In the window, dawn practices being reliable. There is a day when a global luxury brand offers him a contract fat enough to solve the month in a single sitting. The brief. Attach opulence to the idea of cultural endurance. He can do it with one hand. The other hand will pay 3 bills and a dentist. He walks to the river instead. On the pier, a boy sells paper birds again, and again Lin does not buy one, because some freedoms do not belong on invoices. A fisherman mends a net, whose patience makes the city look like a beginner. Lin lets the wind put his hair in a mood, and watches the current decide. He takes out his phone and writes, "Thank you for the offer. I can't do this one. The story you want deserves to belong to itself. Send." The world does what it always does. Continues. He meets the conservation crew at a site where a small stupa is learning to be respected again. They set the scaffold, which is merely a way of admitting height without being arrogant about it. Lin climbs slowly, his body remembering that fear is not prophecy. At the top he rests his palm on ancient brick and without ritual says, "I'm done drinking from that cup." A boy below asks what he said. Lin says, "I said this lime is good," and the foreman laughs, because honesty sometimes requires translation. At dusk, he returns to Shwedagon with a bag of candles and a mercy he didn't have last year. He lights one for a king he forgave, one for a son who tried to be a hinge, one for a courier who learned to write in straight lines, and finally also in true ones. He lights one for a scholar on another shore. The smoke marks the air with small signatures the wind is delighted to collect. On the steps, a tourist asks him to take a photo. He frames it so the gold looks like kindness rather than conquest. He hands the phone back, and the tourist says, "Perfect," in a language Lin doesn't speak. He nods anyway, which is a kind of fluency. The knight offers him a seat. He accepts. He remembers a nameless stupa, leaning into a tamarind tree. He remembers a cup set down. He remembers a river that lets even heavy stories float. He remembers Aiko's omamori tucked into his notebook, where the crease makes a small shrine of paper. He thinks, if she returns, I will take her to the delta, where the water pretends to be land, and the land pretends to be water, and we will talk about kings less and people more. If she does not return, the vow does. Either way, the sentence is clean. Above him, a bell is struck, and the sound does not argue. The city breathes in, breathes out. Somewhere a boy finishes his homework, and a woman hangs wet shirts evenly. History, having auditioned as tragedy, settles back into its older role, teacher of proportions. Lin Ochtet rises, dusts his knees, and walks home by a road that remembers him. The gate of his apartment accepts his key without commentary. At his desk that faces east, he writes a line and does not delete it. Outside, the rain soaks the city in a tenderness that refuses metaphors because it is already enough to be rain. The river is still there when you close your eyes. It moves on the far side of your lids, a dark silver ribbon that doesn't need your permission to keep carrying names. On its banks, brick sleep stacked in patient rows. In their pores, the day's heat loosens itself like a fist, forgetting why it closed. Somewhere a nameless stupa leans into a tree that has been alive longer than your most stubborn sorrow. Somewhere a cup sits on a table and no one lifts it. Somewhere a gate remembers how to be only a frame for the sky. Somewhere, in a city that knows the recipe for evening, a man sets his desk toward morning and answers a letter with a kindness he can afford. And far away, under a cedar that counts centuries the way you count breaths, a woman fingers a small lotus stamp and smiles as if a door opened between languages and found less difference than anyone predicted. Let the story put itself away now. Let it find the shelf that doesn't need labels. Let the night do the old work of mending. Good night.